Eh bien, bonjour à tous, merci d'être là pour cette rencontre avec Deborah Eisenberg, parce que c'est un événement, cette rencontre, sachant que Deborah Eisenberg est un écrivain rare à plus d'un titre, nous le verrons, écrivain rare parce qu'elle écrit peu, écrivain rare parce qu'elle vient peu en France, écrivain rare parce qu'elle est assez méconnue en France, ce qui est dommage, puisque elle est parmi les nouvellistes américaines à l'égal, par exemple, d'une Anne Beattie ou d'Alice Munro, on en parlera, voilà, toute cette constellation de nouvellistes qui nous parlent du monde occidental et de l'Amérique d'aujourd'hui. Alors, John Updike, par exemple, le grand John Updike, disait d'elle qu'elle avait trouvé des mots pour des sentiments qui n'avaient jamais été décrits avant elle. C'est pour dire à quel point elle a été et elle est reconnue. Alors, 3 recueils sont parus en français, je vous les donne. Le crépuscule des super-héros en 2009, Transaction dans une monnaie étrangère en 1994 et Petit désordre sans importance. Peut-être que, pour commencer, je vais parler du crépuscule des super-héros, qui est le dernier recueil qui est paru en France et qui a eu un certain succès et qui, je crois, cristallise un peu tous vos thèmes, toutes vos questions, que ce soit les questions que vous vous posez sur la culture américaine, sur les personnages, sur le désespoir aussi de certains personnages. Alors, peut-être, Deborah Eisenberg, pour commencer, quand vous appelez votre livre « Le crépuscule des super-héros », est-ce que c'est pour annoncer d'emblée que vous ne vous intéresserez pas aux super-héros, mais aux autres, c'est-à-dire aux personnages faibles, aux personnages marginaux, parfois même aux personnages blessés?
I think I take these off now. Yes. Well, the title, The Twilight of the Superheroes, is, of course, it refers to the ring cycle, the Wagnerian ring cycle, which the title of one of the operas being Twilight of the Gods. And so it's really a very complicated title to have chosen. First of all, I thought it was very funny, but most of the stories in the book really reflect a vision of the end of empire, the end of the empire of the United States in particular, the dissolution of that political reality and that mentality. And of course, Americans, and when I say Americans, I really am referring to the United States specifically, have had a view of themselves, certainly since 1945, as sort of big, kindly, beneficent, naive people who go around the world doing good and spreading democracy. Well, this is a cartoon view of oneself. And it's a view which I think we no longer really exactly have, but it's, I think that I was tremendously interested in the title story, particularly the story in that collection that's called Twilight of the Superheroes, the changing view of ourselves, the way that circumstances and history have forced us to look at ourselves somewhat differently and possibly somewhat more realistically.
Parce que c'est vrai que vous avez écrit ce livre quelques années après le 11 septembre, et à l'heure où les Américains se découvraient les plus vulnérables. Comment expliquez-vous que vous ayez été si peu d'écrivains à écrire aussi vite sur ce ressenti de grande faiblesse américaine?
Possibly because it's a very frightening discovery. I really don't, I have no idea why that wasn't, I mean, I'm sure it is reflected in one way or another in a great deal of our fiction, but it isn't so much the matter of our vulnerability that really captured my attention and my interests as the experience of the self-delusion being frayed or becoming evanescent. Actually, I would say that in a sense, it became, I mean, our experience that we refer to as 9/11, the bombing of the huge World Trade Center, it really became, vulnerability is an element that became a pretext for punishment all over the world. And I think that when Americans feel vulnerable, well, there's something a little unrealistic about that. And yet, we've used it as an occasion to become increasingly militarized, increasingly violent, all over the world and at home. So that has interested me a great deal. In fact, just last fall, in New York, we had the terrifying experience of a hurricane which destroyed an immense amount of property. I don't mean personal property, but buildings, homes where people lived, streets, cars, and many people were without power for days, without electricity or food, without heat. And that was an experience that affected really an enormous number of people. But in a way, it's more alarming, I think, to people, and writers have written less about it, because after all, you can't go around punishing the weather. You can't, bomb a hurricane. So, and yet everything we do simply increases the likelihood of climate change and catastrophic weather. I'm sorry, that was a rather confused answer to a simple question.
Thank you. Ces personnages faibles, voilà, vulnérables, ils ne sont pas apparus dans le crépuscule des super-héros, puisque dans Petit désordre sans importance, votre second recueil, il y avait déjà cette jeunesse des années 80 que vous décriviez, qui passait de petit boulot en petit boulot, qui avait de gros problèmes d'argent et qui était complètement rejetée de la société new-yorkaise. Pourquoi vous vous êtes intéressé à cette jeunesse-là, voilà, qui avait tant de mal à exister dans cette ville d'effort qu'est New York?
Well, many years ago, I was one of them. My generation is the 1960s. That's when I was young and broke and couldn't, there was no place for me in the city. But I'm very interested, and probably all writers are, in the displaced, the marginal, people with no real place to be, because most writers are outsiders. I think it's a much harder life now for young people, certainly in New York, than it's ever been. It's really, when I first came to New York, you could live there as a student, you could live there as an immigrant, you could live there as an artist, and live there in a perfectly acceptable way. Now it really is a city for rich people. The whole country has become economically polarized to an amazing degree, but it's very, very hard for young people to live in New York now.
Vous écrivez d'ailleurs dans plusieurs de vos livres que New York est comme un mirage et que finalement il est habité par la nostalgie, mais qu'il est un rêve que beaucoup de gens partagent et qui n'existe pas vraiment. Vous dites même un film de propagande dans le crépuscule des super-héros. Qu'est-ce que vous entendez par là?
That referred to a specific moment, the idea of New York as a propaganda movie, when people were simply pretending that nothing frightening or terrible had happened, and were pretending that they weren't frightened. But actually, I think of the whole country in a way as a propaganda movie. You know, when you go to the airport, when you, well, I always think of it as an airport. You're surrounded by screens with television on all the time, giving you a version of the news which is really not very accurate in any way, and certainly not very meaningful, and is very flattering to certain ideas, and always presents a picture of a kind of affluent society which does not exist for most people any longer, or for many, many people any longer. And it is becoming rapidly degraded, the economic situation for many, 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 many people in the US. There is now a large and growing sector of the poor, and a very small but growing sector of the extremely rich, and a smaller and smaller middle class. But if you're surrounded by these screens, there's a sort of pretense that there's a happy, untroubled middle class of consumers, always. You know, it's all a big advertisement. It's a huge advertising machine.
Vous avez donc le crépuscule des super-héros, c'était sur l'Amérique d'après le choc du 11 septembre. Après ce que vous venez de dire, on peut se demander si vous n'allez pas écrire un recueil sur l'Amérique d'après le choc des subprimes, d'après de la crise financière.
No. But, you know, of course, every piece of fiction is set in a real world. And I don't write historical fiction. So the world that I see and the world that will appear on a piece of paper is going to reflect the circumstances in which people live.
Parce que ce qui est frappant quand on lit vos recueils, c'est la métamorphose de l'Amérique. Et la métamorphose de New York, telle que vous le décrivez, de recueil en recueil. Est-ce que c'est ça que vous recherchez justement, cette idée d'une ville en mouvement que vous reproduiriez dans vos nouvelles?
Not really. I don't feel, I know people sometimes refer to me as a specifically New York writer, but in fact, many of the stories, in my opinion, are set in other places, in other parts of the country, in other parts of the world. And of course, change is very interesting, and I am interested in the real effect on people's lives, the concrete effect on people's lives of political and sociological and economic change, cultural change. But it's not really what I want to make is an aesthetic experience for people.
Et justement, cette expérience esthétique, je l'ai dit, vous êtes plutôt dans un style mineur. C'est ça que vous êtes, vous l'avez dit, plutôt l'anti-wagnérienne, l'anti-baroque. Et par rapport à un écrivain comme Alice Munro, à qui on pourrait vous comparer pour certains personnages, on pourrait dire que si elle est dans la cruauté, vous êtes dans une forme de douceur, de compassion envers vos personnages. Est-ce que c'est le cas?
I'm really not sure. I mean, I certainly feel compassion for my characters. I feel compassion for Alice Munro's characters too. I admire her so much. But I'm sorry, the first part of the question again.
Je disais que Munro, justement, sur qui vous avez d'ailleurs écrit un article, il y avait quelque chose de très cruel dans sa façon dans les destins qu'elle décrit. Vous, c'est quelque chose de beaucoup plus invisible que vous décrivez, de beaucoup plus doux, d'une certaine manière.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Many people have complained to me over the years that they don't like my characters, which irritates me for two reasons. One is that I like them, but I don't care if nobody else likes them. So that's two reasons. But I do feel, in a way, it is my obligation to be the advocate of people, even people who might not be very attractive from the outside. I'm much more interested in, I really have no interest in judging a character or even evaluating whether they're an appealing or an attractive human being. I'm much more interested in discovering who that person is, and that tends to be an internal discovery rather than an external discovery. So perhaps that conveys that impression.
Il y a cette nouvelle dans le crépuscule des super-héros qui s'appelle « Le ver est dans le fruit », où on voit une femme littéralement étouffée par son mari et son fils, son mari muet et son fils qui lui parle et qui est sans cesse très agressif. Et cette femme va à tout prix essayer de trouver sa liberté en quittant ce foyer. pourquoi êtes-vous toujours intéressé par des personnages comme ça qui cherchent leur liberté à tout prix, leur liberté individuelle à tout prix?
Well, I suppose I think that, first of all, I admire the struggle to lead one's life as a person with autonomy. I admire it very much. And also, I think that most people, in fact, really do it to the extent that they're able to. Most people, I mean, it's not very clear what a person is, what an individual is. And I mean, I think each human being contains many, many possibilities, many different humans. And I read, 2 days ago, that actually people contain different sets of DNA, to everybody's amazement. But I think the experience of being human is so mysterious, so fascinating, and the exploration of it, of course, ideally doesn't stop. What am I? Am I partly you? What do we have to do with one another? What do each of us have to do with the whole world? It's an endless exploration, and if you give it up and you just say, well, I'm this, I stop here, really you might as well be dead. And that's a terrible condition, but I suppose I'm not that interested in exploring that kind of death. I'm interested in exploring the struggle against it, because of course, it's very one gets tired all the time from morning to night. It's just hard enough to be a human being, even if you're a very, very fortunate human being, even if you're a happy human being, even if your life is filled with candies and soap bubbles. It's quite difficult, and people, it's a big temptation just to say, well, this is what I am. And in fact, I grew up in a suburb which was quite antiseptic, a suburb in the middle of the United States, in the middle of the century, and nobody wanted anything to change or move. Everybody wanted everything to be very nice and happy, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's a sort of recipe for anguish and misery. And I think that feeling of suffocation that you identify in the story called A Flaw in the Design is possibly a response to the desire that people have to just stop, lie down.
C'est un sentiment que vous-même avez eu jeune, au point de fuir?
Well, I didn't technically run away. It was closer to being thrown out of the house. But I actually could not wait to get away. I couldn't wait to get out of the house, away from my family, into a city. Yeah, could not wait.
Ce que vous décrivez très bien aussi, ce sont ces ces lieux dans les relations où parfois on n'a pas de mots pour dire les choses. Je pense par exemple à la première nouvelle de Petit désordre sans importance qui s'appelle Conte moral et dans laquelle on voit les limites de l'amitié, c'est-à-dire une amitié entre une jeune femme et un homme. Et au bout d'un moment, cette amitié se transforme en quelque chose d'extrêmement mortifère. Est-ce que vous cherchez toujours comme ça à pousser au plus loin certaines relations pour qu'on arrive à quelque chose de non identifié, de franchement mystérieux?
Yes, always. Oops. Have I done something terrible? Thank you. I'm absolutely interested more than anything else in the inarticulable, that which cannot be put into words, that which cannot be, oh, sorry. This is not a robbery. This has to do with the microphone. The most delicious challenge of writing to me is to put into words things that cannot be put into words. And that's exactly what I aspire to do with relationships, with personal experience, everything. Unmapped territory between people, the mysteries of being alive, the experience that cannot be described.
D'autant plus que vos personnages eux-mêmes sont souvent incapables de formuler ce qui leur arrive ou ce qu'ils ressentent.
Yes, it's a very, very interesting matter to write, to enable people who cannot express themselves to express themselves. After all, nobody is really made out of straw. People really have intense and very specific experiences, feelings, desires, but putting those things into words is something else entirely. And of course, it's never an accurate reflection to do it directly. It has to be done obliquely. But yes, that is something that I like to do very much.
Il y a aussi une dimension politique dans vos nouvelles qui n'est peut-être pas évidente à la première lecture. Et pourtant, vous nous disiez à Transfuge en 2009, dans cet entretien que vous nous aviez accordé, que à vos yeux, il n'y a aucun moment dans la vie qui soit totalement dénué de politique. Qu'entendiez-vous par là?
Well, I'm defining political very broadly, of course. And what I mean is that the relationships between people are expressed and sifted through social institutions like class, like economic level. Those are very, very real aspects of our lives, and we can't divorce ourselves from them any more than we can divorce ourselves from our bodies. I mean, I myself would prefer to be you know, perhaps to be a 22-year-old blonde. Well, it's not going to happen. And in that way, I'm also the person that has been made by my history, and all of us are, and by our circumstances. And even if we have the most intimate and personal conversation, every aspect of that information, of that conversation, is to a certain extent predetermined by the circumstances of our lives. So that's what I mean.
Vous montrez ça très bien dans la seconde nouvelle de Petits désordres sans importance qui s'appelle Le cambriolage, où on voit un couple très moderne de jeunes Américains qui ont une gêne vis-à-vis de leur domestique noir. Et pourtant, c'est quelque chose de contemporain. Est-ce que c'est ce genre de politique-là, c'est-à-dire celle qui est invisible mais qui traverse la société américaine, que vous vouliez mettre en évidence dans vos nouvelles?
Yes, I'd say in that particular story, the robbery, there's a history, well, everywhere between whoever it is that happens to have been the oppressed population and the population or the demographic that happens to be the demographic of the oppressors. And exactly right, there's no way for any of these people to get around their history. And, but they are not their history, they're the people who are alive right then. Well, what happens with all of that? It's endlessly interesting to me.
Vous déclariez aussi à propos de l'Amérique dans votre dernier recueil, ici les temps changent aussi vite que les horloges comptent les secondes. Est-ce que vous avez l'impression que depuis l'écriture du crépuscule des super-héros, l'Amérique a à ce point changé?
I do think that there has been a significant change. Certainly, we have the picture of ourselves that I mentioned earlier, of the happy, benign, helpful international figure, has shifted radically to we've accepted a new and rather terrifying view of ourselves as people who torture, who kill, who live above and without the law. I mean, we've gutted our constitutional protections for ourselves and other people. We've destroyed them to a very, very great degree. We've accepted this. It gives us definitely a less cheerful feeling about ourselves. We've accepted ourselves as a nation that has enabled very few corporate and banking families to amass a great deal of the wealth of the world. We've accepted that in ourselves, not very happily, but we can no longer sustain the illusion at all. And now, of course, we have the amazing revelation of the NSA spying, which is huge. It's enormous. And of course, you never see anybody on the street in New York who isn't talking into their phone, or at dinner, not talking into their phone. Everybody is always with their phone all the time, getting their email or their iPads or whatever. Well, we've learned that we've bought our own tracking devices. We're actually, you know, in the East Bloc, before the dissolution of the East Bloc, a tremendous amount of effort and work was put in by the Soviet government on getting people to spy on each other. We figured out how to get people to spy on themselves. It's marvelous. You don't have to pay anybody. All you have to do is sell somebody a telephone or give somebody a credit card. Every purchase is tracked and amassed, and there are these huge data banks that are collecting. I remember going to Prague in 1986 and being put in the hotel that you were put into, and the ceiling, you knew, was just a tissue of cameras and recording devices and so on. Now, the very purse that is holding my microphone, or was, has my phone in it, my credit card, all of it tracking me.
À l'époque où vous nous aviez donné un entretien à Transfuge, ce qui était frappant, c'était votre connaissance aiguë de la littérature contemporaine. Vous nous aviez par exemple parlé des nouvelles de Peter Nadas que vous veniez de lire, et puis d'Alice Munro. Est-ce que vous continuez à être aussi attentive à ce qui se fait dans le monde, et particulièrement chez les nouvellistes, puisque c'est votre forme?
I'm terribly sorry I got that whole question in French. So the
Okay.
I'm sorry, I forgot to press.
Okay, I should repeat.
A few years ago, you told us about literature, and we were quite impressed by your knowledge of short story writers. Do you still have the same interest in short story writers?
I am interested in short story writers. Did you ask me about
Yes, I
Peter
meant the
Nadas?
contemporary short writers. Do you admire some?
I do admire. There are an amazing number of marvelous contemporary short story writers. I wouldn't even begin to list them. Excellent writers. I am a very slow reader, so I'm way behind. But I'm not exclusively interested in the short story. I love to read novels. I mean, I'm very glad that The Brothers Karamazov is not a short story.
Vous nous aviez dit aussi que vous n'aviez pas d'influence évidente et majeure. Pour parler de vous, certains ont parlé de Henry James, pour justement ces sentiments qui jusque-là n'avaient pas été décrits. D'autres ont parlé de Tchekhov pour l'art de la nouvelle. Mais vous continuez à dire que vous n'avez pas de maître.
Well, I would love to be influenced, but it's not so easy to get influenced. I never read a particular amount of Henry James. It's been many, many years since I've read Henry James. Yes, I loved Henry James a lot, but not anymore, and Chekhov, but no more than I've loved other writers. I think it's just a natural aesthetic affinity.
Comme il nous reste il nous reste peu de temps, mais je voulais quand même savoir s'il y avait des questions dans la salle de gens qui ont assisté au public. Oui, oui, je crois, mademoiselle.
I'm sorry, but if these people have no microphone, I am not going to be able to do anything with these questions.
She will ask in English.
Okay, right. But that's the same. Then if the question is in English.
I was just wondering I'm wondering if there are any topics that you've exhausted during your career, whether because you've written so much about them and you're bored of writing about that, or whether you actually think you've expressed it well enough that you don't want to go back to it.
I don't think I've ever expressed anything well enough. And I don't like to, once I've done something, I've done it and I'm finished with it. I don't repeat myself, in my opinion. But it's difficult to say what it is that one has done and one hasn't done. So if there's something in my life or in my mind that still interests me, it's definitely going to come out on the piece of paper.
Une autre question, maybe another question?
I think, oh, maybe that was a hand, or maybe it wasn't. I'll tell you anything.
Be careful. No?
Well, can you tell us what your indulgent topics are?
What my
Indulgent topics are?
Indulgent.
Indulgent, like what topics excite you so much and you feel like you're indulging when you write about them?
Oh, you mean that it's like eating a piece of cake or something? Well, I really don't know. Anything that I happen to be writing about. I mean, it's not a delightful activity, writing, for the most part. It's not really an indulgent pleasure in a way. It's really very difficult effort. So, and I don't actually think of the world lying before me that is to be discovered as topics. It doesn't sort of divide nicely into topics. So I just find myself there's, for example, I find myself responding to a phrase, some words that ring in my head, or there's some scene that stays in my imagination, a sort of picture of some sort, and I go towards that. But I think that there are writers who have sort of favorite things to write about, but I'm just not one of them.
How do you turn out the rest of the world and write?
Oh, well, with great difficulty.
Do you have any, like, 2 or 3 things that you do that might be helpful to?
The thing that's helpful to me, and in fact indispensable to me, is to have an enormous amount of time. And if I don't have a lot of time in front of me, I can't, I don't sit down to work because it's just going to make me too angry. So, for example, I teach half of the year, and I don't try to write while I'm teaching, unless I'm already very, very entrenched in a particular piece of work. But otherwise, I wait until I can have time to myself, really to myself, because I can't, I don't have the kind of flexibility that enables me to go from one concern to another. I can't keep them pristine. It's an odd thing about writing that if you're a writer, in a way, you're always working. But, or you could say, you're never working. But sitting down at the piece of paper, I need time. I know I need to know that the next day I'm going to have time, and the day after that I'm going to have time. I need really a lot of time. I don't, have special pajamas or, have a cup of coffee next to me. Anything will do. And I'm very portable, but just time.
Going back to that question of trying to write about that which is not writable about or not sayable, and you may not be able to answer this question, but is there anything you can say about how to approach, or how you actually, the process of actually trying to find a way to articulate something that's inarticulate?
Yeah, I think that I can, if not answer that question, I can address it in some way, which is going through the senses. That is, use your ears, use your eyes. What does it feel like? What does this feel like? What does that feel like? What do you see? What do you hear?
And then I guess it's, or perhaps it's not, but is it then about words? Does it really come down to how a sentence shows itself in a way, or does a lot of the learning for you or the discovery happen through the word, the actual word?
The actual words.
Une question. Comment voyez-vous l'avenir du numérique? Pardon. Comment voyez-vous l'avenir de la littérature à l'époque du numérique et où, à l'époque où tout va vite, trop vite sans doute? Quel est votre regard? Quel regard vous portez sur ça?
Oh, I really have no idea. I suppose time will tell, but readers seem to be born despite the fact that the world is filled with machines. People who actually like to read books and love literature. So with all the blogging and all the tweeting and so on, there are still people who just want to pick up a book and read what somebody said.
Thank you. I just wondered, very simply, what made you decide to start writing? Because I understand that you started a little bit later.
Well, very simply to answer, I stopped smoking.
I understand that.
Yes, I mean, all my intense experiences when I was a child were reading experiences. And everybody had always thought that I would be a writer, except me. It never occurred to me that, I thought writers were gods. I didn't know. I didn't know they were actual people who actually tried very hard to do something. I thought they were born being able to do it. I wasn't born being able to do it, so It never occurred to me that I would be able to do it if I tried very hard. And then I stopped smoking. So,
The nervous habit can take an awful lot of energy away from everything else.
yeah, it takes a lot of energy and it mops up a lot of energy. And then, of course, you emit clouds around you. And, you know.
Very mysterious. It makes everything be much more mysterious.
Yes,
Right. and
yeah.
Bon, bah, thank you very much.
Thank you
Merci
so
beaucoup.
much. Thank you very, very much.